The river was already rising when she woke up. Not by much, just a finger's width higher on the measuring stone than it had been the night before. But Nefret had been watching the Nile long enough to know what that meant. Summer was coming, and summer in Egypt meant the flood was on its way, which meant the fields would die before they could be reborn, which meant the next few months would be a very specific kind of beautiful chaos that made this civilization unlike anything else the ancient world had ever produced. She pressed her
Who's
hands
there?
flat against the warm mud of the river
I thought I heard
and
something.
watched the water move. It was approximately 1280 BC, give or take a decade, and the most powerful empire in the known world was waking up around her. Welcome to Dull Tales. I'm glad you're here tonight, and I'm especially glad you're comfortable, because we're going to take a long, slow, unhurried walk through one of the strangest and most extraordinary civilizations in human history. Tonight we're going to ancient Egypt, not the Egypt of dramatic Hollywood battles or the breathless documentary narrators who say things like, a mystery that has baffled scientists. We're going to the actual Egypt, the one where people woke up before dawn and made bread and
Press
argued
down
about
firmly,
grain
dear.
prices,
Like
and
this,
painted
Mama?
their eyes
Yes,
black and
just
worried
like
about
that.
their
It's
children, and
working!
went to work and came home and ate dinner and died, and got buried with their furniture because they wanted to use it in the afterlife. The everyday Egypt, the one that ran continuously for 3,000 years and is still the most fascinating civilization that has ever existed on this planet, and I include the modern one. Before we go in, do me a favor. If you're enjoying what we do here at Dull Tales, these long, slow, comfortable walks through the past, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference for a small channel. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. I want to know. Someone is always listening from somewhere completely unexpected, and it makes my evening every single time. Now get comfortable. You're going to want to be very comfortable for this one because ancient Egypt rewards slowness. The more you slow down, the more you see. Here's what I want you to think about before we begin. Have you ever wondered what it actually smelled like inside a temple in ancient Egypt? Not the incense smell from your imagination. The real smell, linen and natron and roasting meat and the river at low tide. What did ordinary Egyptians eat for breakfast? Was it the same bread every single day, or was ancient Egyptian breakfast culture more interesting than that? Spoiler, it was more interesting. Did Egyptian workers ever go on strike? Did they ever say, we're not working until someone pays us? They did. It's documented. It's one of the best stories in ancient history. What happened if you were too poor to afford a proper burial? Did you just get skipped by the gods? Was there a budget version of the afterlife? Why did Egyptian men wear eyeliner? And did it work on the people they were trying to impress? What was the actual working day of someone building a pyramid? What did they eat? Where did they sleep? Did they get days off? And what happened if they got hurt? And perhaps most importantly, how did a civilization that lasted 3,000 years manage to stay Egypt while everything around it changed, collapsed, was conquered and rebuilt? What was the secret? Tonight we find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in ancient Egypt, approximately 1280 BC, during the reign of Ramesses II, the pharaoh so extra that he built giant statues of himself up and down the Nile just to make sure nobody forgot who was in charge. The flood season is approaching. The temples are full of smoke and prayer, and somewhere a scribe is already writing things down because Egyptians write everything down, and that is one of the great gifts they left us. Get comfortable. We're going in. Let's start with the river. Because in ancient Egypt you cannot start anywhere else. Everything, and I mean everything, the crops, the calendar, the religion, the economy, the entire structure of civilization runs on the Nile. Not beside the Nile, not near the Nile, on it, because of it, in complete and total dependence on it. Egypt without the Nile is not a less impressive civilization. Egypt without the Nile is a desert, literally. The country is almost entirely desert. The habitable strip along the river is, in many places, only a few kilometers wide. Beyond that, east and west, nothing grows. The sand takes over immediately and completely and without apology. So the Egyptians built their entire world inside that narrow green corridor along the river, and then they built a religion around the river, and then they built a government around managing what the river did every year, and the result, after 3,000 years of refinement, was one of the most organized, sophisticated, and genuinely strange societies in the ancient world. Here is what the Nile does every year that makes all of this possible. In late summer, the river floods. Not gently, aggressively. The Nile rises several meters above its normal level, spills across the entire floodplain, and covers the fields in deep brown water for weeks. To a modern observer, this looks like a disaster. Fields underwater, villages flooded, animals relocated to higher ground, farmers sitting on their rooftops watching their crops drown. But this is not a disaster. This is a delivery. The floodwater carries with it enormous quantities of dark, extraordinarily rich silt from deep inside Africa. When the water recedes, it leaves this silt behind in a thick layer across the fields. And that silt is, by any agricultural standard, one of the most fertile substances on Earth. It requires almost no additional fertilizer. It replenishes itself every single year. It turns the Nile corridor into one of the most productive agricultural landscapes the ancient world ever saw. The Egyptians called it the gift of the Nile. They were not wrong. They also, very sensibly, built their calendar around it. The Egyptian year had 3 seasons. Akhit, the flooding season, when the fields were underwater and most agricultural work was impossible. Paret, the growing season, when the water receded and crops were planted in the new silt. And Shemu, the harvest season, when everything came in. If you knew which season you were in, you knew what everyone around you was doing, what taxes were owed, what festivals were coming, what the gods expected, and what your neighbors were worried about. The calendar was the civilization. Our friend Nefret, pressing her hands into the warm mud of the riverbank as the water begins its slow rise, is a woman who has organized her entire life around these rhythms. She is 32 years old. She lives in the town of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of the Nile, opposite the city of Thebes, and she is one of perhaps 1,000 people who live in this small, walled community set into the desert hills. Deir el-Medina is not an ordinary village. It is, by any historical measure, one of the most extraordinary places in the ancient world, a purpose-built community of skilled workers and their families, created specifically to house the people who build and decorate the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings just over the hill. The workers who live here are not slaves. This is one of the great misconceptions about ancient Egypt, the image of enslaved people building the pyramids and temples under the whip, which comes largely from a very famous film and bears limited resemblance to what the historical record actually shows. The people of Deir el-Medina are state employees. They are paid. They have contracts. They have rights. They can sue their employers. They sometimes go on strike. We will get to the strike. It is a wonderful story. But first, let us walk into the village with Nefret and see what an ordinary morning looks like. The village of Deir el-Medina is compact and organized. 2 rows of houses face each other across a narrow main street. Each house follows a similar layout. A front room for receiving visitors, a middle room for daily living, a back room for sleeping, and a cellar or storage area below. The houses share walls, which keeps them cooler in summer and warmer in the desert nights. And the architecture is efficient in the way that architecture becomes efficient when people have been thinking about how to live in a hot, dry climate for a very long time. Nefret's house smells in the early morning of wood smoke and bread. The bread is already baking because in a household with 3 children and a husband who leaves before dawn, bread starts being made before most modern people would consider waking up to be reasonable. The dough was prepared the previous evening. Emmer wheat flour, water, a small portion of fermented dough saved from the previous batch as a leavening agent, and whatever additions made sense that day, perhaps some honey if there was any, perhaps some garlic, perhaps just plain. The baking is done in a clay oven set into one corner of the backyard, and the smell of it travels through the small house and out into the narrow street, mixing with the smells of the neighbor's bread and the animals penned at the edge of the village, and the dry stone of the desert hills above, and the distant, organic, distinctive smell of the Nile water beginning to move. Ancient Egyptian bread was, incidentally, terrible for your teeth. This is not because the Egyptians were bad bakers. They were actually very accomplished bakers. The problem was the millstones. When grain was ground between stone millstones, small particles of grit inevitably ended up in the flour, and when people ate the bread every day for their entire lives, those particles gradually wore their teeth down to the roots. Egyptian mummies examined by modern dental researchers consistently show dramatic tooth wear, often accompanied by the infections and abscesses that follow when enamel disappears. So the bread was delicious, and it slowly destroyed your teeth, which is a trade-off ancient Egyptians made without complaint, possibly because they had no idea, and possibly because there was no alternative, and mostly because the bread was genuinely very good. Nefret tears a piece off a still warm loaf and eats it standing in the doorway, looking out at the street. The village is waking up around her. A neighbor's dog moves through the lane. Somewhere nearby, a child cries briefly and is comforted. The sound of another oven's fire. The specific, pre-dawn quality of a desert morning, which is cool in a way that feels borrowed. The heat will arrive later with the sun, and will make the coolness feel like a memory and blue dark and completely quiet except for the birds. She drinks water from a ceramic vessel and thinks about the day. Her husband Ka left before she woke up. This is normal. Ka is a draughtsman, one of the artists who designs and draws the preliminary sketches for the wall paintings and relief carvings inside the royal tombs. His work begins at dawn, when the light is still bearable, and he will spend the day in the tomb with the rest of his crew, working by lamplight in the underground chambers, covering the walls with the precise, elegant, deeply symbolic imagery that the pharaoh will need in the afterlife. The Valley of the Kings is perhaps a 20-minute walk from the village, over the desert ridge, but that walk crosses some of the most inhospitable terrain in Egypt. In summer, the rocky hills above Deir el-Medina absorb the sun's heat like a kiln, and by midday the temperature in the valley can reach levels that make extended outdoor work genuinely dangerous. Which is why the workers operate in shifts, with a crew going in at dawn, working through the worst of the heat underground where at least the temperature is constant, and returning in the late afternoon. Another crew works by torchlight in the evening. It is an unusual life, in many ways. These workers spend their careers decorating the insides of tombs they will never see once the burial is complete. Chambers sealed under thousands of tons of rock. Their work entombed forever alongside the pharaoh's body and his furniture and his food and his best weapons and everything else he might need in the field of reeds. But they are remarkably well documented, these workers of Deir el-Medina, because Egyptians write things down and the people of this village wrote things down with particular enthusiasm. The archaeological site has yielded thousands of ostraca, fragments of pottery and limestone flakes used as informal writing surfaces, covered with the daily records of village life. Work rosters, legal disputes, love letters, shopping lists, medical notes, complaints about colleagues. Notes from the foreman about who showed up late and why. The reasons people gave for not showing up to work in ancient Egypt's most prestigious construction project are, by the way, one of the genuine delights of Egyptology. The absence records from Deir el-Medina include making mummy, which presumably refers to attending to a family member's burial preparations. His wife is menstruating. This was considered a valid reason to stay home, presumably because the household required his assistance. Drunk, just that. Drunk, written down in the official record with what feels, across 3,000 years, like the resigned sigh of a foreman who has seen this before and will see it again. Bitten by a scorpion, which is not funny, because scorpions in the Egyptian desert are not small or forgiving, but which appears in the records with a regularity that suggests scorpion encounters were simply a feature of daily life that occasionally interrupted work schedules. And most magnificently, he was absent because he was celebrating with his brother. The brother is not named. The celebration is not specified. The record simply notes the absence and moves on, and 3,200 years later a historian reads it and feels a warm flicker of recognition, because celebrating with your brother is still a reason people miss work, and some things about being human do not change. Now, let me tell you about the food. Because ancient Egyptian food is one of the most underrated topics in all of historical inquiry, and I think it deserves proper attention. The basic diet of ordinary Egyptians was bread and beer, not in a grim, joyless way, in the sense that these were the foundational staples around which everything else was organized, the way that rice forms the center of many modern Asian meals or pasta forms the center of Italian cooking. Bread and beer were not deprivation. They were the baseline. The beer was not like modern beer in any import. Way except that it was fermented and it was made from grain. Egyptian beer was thick, slightly sour, nutritionally dense, and significantly less alcoholic than most modern equivalents, closer to a liquid bread than to a glass of lager. It was consumed by everyone, including children, partly because it provided calories and nutrients, and partly because the fermentation process made it safer to drink than water from the Nile, which could carry any number of unpleasant things. Workers were paid partly in beer. This is not a joke. The daily ration for a worker at a major construction project included a set amount of bread loaves and a set amount of beer jars, along with some grain and sometimes oil and cloth and various other goods. The payment system was barter-based. Egypt did not use coined money until very late in its history, and beer was a stable, valuable, practical currency. Imagine showing up to collect your paycheck and being handed several loaves of bread and a jug of beer. This is what ancient Egyptian employment looked like. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet was actually quite varied, at least by ancient standards. The Nile and its papyrus marshes provided fish in enormous quantities, tilapia particularly, which was dried or salted for preservation and consumed at almost every economic level. Vegetables grew abundantly in the irrigated fields: onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, beans, lentils. Fruit was available seasonally: figs, dates, grapes, pomegranates. Meat appeared at festivals, and for the wealthy more regularly, primarily beef and duck and goose. But the majority of Egyptians would have had meat occasionally rather than daily. Back in Nefret's kitchen, and calling it a kitchen is generous, it is really just the back section of the house where the cooking happens. The morning meal is taking shape. Bread, obviously. A thick vegetable stew kept warm from the night before, made with onions and garlic and dried lentils and whatever green things were available. Beer in a ceramic jar. Dried figs from the storage room. This is not a romantic breakfast, but it is a complete one: protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, calories, and it will sustain a family through a morning of physical work in the desert heat. Her eldest daughter, Ipit, is 12 years old and already responsible for helping prepare the morning meal. This is not childhood labor in the grim industrial sense. It is apprenticeship, the transmission of domestic knowledge from one generation to the next, conducted alongside actual affection, in the specific warm and flour way that kitchens across all of human history have always worked. Ipit is learning to bake. She is learning to read the dough by touch. She is learning when the oven is hot enough and when it has cooled too much. She is learning the proportions by instinct rather than by measurement, the way bakers have always learned them, through repetition and the occasional burned batch. She is also, this morning, learning to make eye paint. Because this is Egypt, and in Egypt you paint your eyes before you go out, and this is not vanity. It is medicine, sort of. The black paint worn around the eyes by Egyptians of both sexes, the look that every school child recognizes from tomb paintings and museum gift shop scarabs, is made primarily from galena, a lead-based mineral ground to a fine powder, and mixed with fat to create a thick, smooth paste. The Egyptians called it kohl. And while wearing a lead-based substance around your eyes every day sounds alarming to modern ears, there is some evidence that it provided genuine protective effects. The paint reduced glare from the intense Egyptian sun. It may have had antibacterial properties, and it kept flies away from the eyes in a climate where flies were a constant presence and eye infections were a persistent problem. Whether or not it was medically effective, it was culturally essential. A person without eye paint in ancient Egypt was a person who had not yet gotten ready for the day. The application of kohl was as fundamental to the morning routine as the bread and the beer, a moment of preparation, of putting on the face that said, "I am a person in the world, and I am ready." Ipit grinds the mineral carefully on a small pallet of polished stone. Nefret watches and corrects and hands her tools. Outside, the blue pre-dawn is becoming pink. The day is about to begin. Let me take you now to the other side of the social ledger, to the palace. Because while Nefret is making bread and eye paint in Deir el-Medina, 400 kilometers to the north in the delta city of Ramesses, the city of Ramesses, the enormous capital that Pharaoh Ramesses II has built for himself with an enthusiasm that borders on the compulsive, an entirely different morning is unfolding. The palace of Ramesses II at Ramesses was, in its day, one of the largest and most spectacular royal residences in the ancient world. Modern archaeology has located it in the northeastern delta region, and the remains, scattered across what is now agricultural land, hint at a building of genuinely staggering scale. Vast halls, painted ceilings, enormous columns, storerooms full of tribute from subject nations, gardens, granaries, stables for the royal chariots, and at the center of it all, the pharaoh himself. Ramesses II deserves his reputation. He ruled Egypt for approximately 67 years, which means he outlived most of his courtiers, most of his contemporaries in other kingdoms, and approximately 12 of his own sons. He had somewhere between 45 and 50 sons by various wives and concubines, plus a similar number of daughters. He claimed to have personally killed hundreds of Hittite warriors at the Battle of Kadesh, carved this claim onto temple walls from one end of Egypt to the other, and then negotiated a peace treaty with the Hittites that historians consider one of the earliest surviving diplomatic agreements in world history. He was also, by any reasonable assessment, one of the greatest builders in the history of the world. The temples at Abu Simbel, the additions to Karnak and Luxor, the Ramesseum, the city of Ramesses itself, Ramesses built on a scale that makes modern architecture look a little timid. He also had a habit of carving his name over monuments built by earlier pharaohs and claiming them as his own work. Ancient Egyptians did not have the word for vandalism, but they might have invented it. A royal morning at the palace of Ramesses II would have begun with ritual, because everything in ancient Egypt began with ritual. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was a god, or more precisely, he was the living manifestation of the god Horus, son of Osiris, keeper of cosmic order, the link between the divine realm and the human one. His first act each morning was a religious act. He did not make his own breakfast, obviously. He was attended from the moment he opened his eyes by a small army of specialists, the servants responsible for his clothing, his cosmetics, his food, his personal items, his spiritual obligations. A royal morning involved ritual washing, ritual anointing with sacred oils, the elaborate process of dressing in the layered, symbolic garments of kingship, the application of cosmetics, and the double crown or the blue war crown or whichever crown was appropriate for the day's activities. The pharaoh's breakfast would have been something dramatically different from Nefret's morning lentils. Palace kitchens produced roasted meats and freshly baked luxury breads with honey, imported oils, exotic fruits, wine in sealed jars, and the best of whatever the empire's tribute had brought in from foreign lands. But here is the thing about being pharaoh that most people don't fully grasp. You could not eat your breakfast alone. Every meal, every ceremony, every official act was attended by courtiers, scribes, advisors, priests, and officials, each of whom had a specific role to perform, a specific place to stand, a specific thing to say or do. The pharaoh existed inside an elaborate ritual structure from which he could not easily step outside. He was, in a very real sense, trapped by his own divinity. The god-king could not scratch his nose without someone writing it down. He could not change his mind about a military strategy without the information filtering through several layers of officials who each had their own interpretations. He could not simply decide, on a quiet Tuesday, to go for a walk along the river without the entire apparatus of royal protocol assembling around him. In this way, the most powerful man in the ancient world had significantly less freedom than Nefret, who could step out of her front door whenever she pleased and watch the Nile rise and press her hands into the mud, and not have anyone write it down or turn it into a religious ceremony. There is a strange justice in this. Or at least, there is something worth noticing. Let me now tell you about the gods, because you cannot discuss ancient Egypt for very long without them, and I mean that literally. The gods are everywhere in this civilization. In the paintings on the walls, in the names people give their children, in the spells written on papyrus, in the amulets worn around the neck, in the decisions made about when to plant crops and when to go to war and how to arrange a funeral. The ancient Egyptian religious system is vast, complex, and in some ways delightfully contradictory. There are hundreds of gods, not dozens, hundreds. Every major city has its own patron deity. Every aspect of nature has a divine representation. The sun is a god, several gods actually, depending on which part of the sky it occupies and which theological tradition you're consulting. The sky is a goddess, Nut, arched over the earth with stars on her belly. The earth is a god, Jeb, lying beneath her. The horizon is a god. The flood is a god. Cats are sacred. Crocodiles are sacred. Ibises are sacred. Cobras are sacred. The scarab beetle, which rolls dung across the ground, is considered a symbol of the sun's daily journey across the sky, and this comparison made perfect sense to ancient Egyptians, which tells you something important about how differently they organized their perceptions of the world. The two gods that matter most for daily life in 1280 BC are probably Osiris and Ra. Osiris is the god of the dead, the underworld, and resurrection. He is depicted as a mummified king, green-skinned, holding the crook and flail of royalty. His story is the central myth of Egyptian religion, murdered by his jealous brother Set, reassembled by his wife Isis, briefly resurrected to conceive a son, Horus, and then installed as the ruler of the afterlife. Every dead Egyptian hopes to stand before Osiris after death and have their heart weighed against a feather, the feather of man, representing truth and justice. If the heart is lighter than the feather, meaning a life lived with integrity, the person passes into the field of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife, which is described as an idealized version of the Nile Valley, familiar and beautiful and permanent. If the heart is heavier than the feather, it is eaten by Ammit, a creature with the head of a crocodile, the front body of a lion, and the back end of a hippopotamus, which is the ancient Egyptian religious establishment's way of saying, your moral failures have consequences. Ra is the sun god, the daily traveler across the sky in his solar bark, the source of all light and heat, and by extension all life in the desert land. Every morning that the sun rises, Ra has successfully fought off the chaos serpent Apophis during his nightly journey through the underworld, and civilization continues for another day. Every morning is a small victory. Every sunset is the beginning of a battle. This is why the Egyptians painted the walls of tombs, to help the dead pharaoh navigate the nighttime underworld and ensure that Ra's journey continued, because if Ra failed, everything failed. When Nefret looks up from her kitchen and sees the light changing color on the desert cliffs above the village, she is watching Ra begin his journey. She probably says a small, informal prayer, not the elaborate ritual prayer of the temple priests. Those prayers require specific words and specific actions and specific clothing and specific times, and are the business of professionals. Nefret's prayer is the kind of prayer that ordinary people in every religion have always said. A quick acknowledgement, a small request, a moment of recognition that the powers running the universe are larger than her particular morning. She finishes her bread. She packs her husband's lunch: bread, dried fish, an onion, a small jar of beer, and hands it to a neighbor's boy who is heading toward the valley with the dawn work crew. Then she picks up her own work. Because Nefret is not a housewife in the modern sense of someone whose work is confined to the household. She is a weaver, a professional one. She produces linen cloth on a horizontal loom in the front room of her house, and the linen she produces is sold and bartered through the village market system, contributing substantially to the household income. Linen was the fabric of ancient Egypt. Not wool, not cotton, not silk linen. Made from flax plants grown in the irrigated fields, processed through several stages of soaking and combing and spinning, and then woven into cloth of varying quality from rough sackcloth to fabric so fine it was essentially transparent. The finest royal linen was, by ancient standards, extraordinary archaeological examples survive that are so delicately woven they make modern fine cotton feel coarse. Egyptians wore linen in white or cream, pleated, draped, wrapped. The familiar images of Egyptian clothing from tomb paintings are largely accurate: men in white kilts or longer garments, women in close-fitting dresses, both in the white linen that was practical in the heat and affordable even at relatively modest economic levels, as long as you knew how to spin and weave, which most Egyptian women did. Nefret sits down at her loom. The rhythmic movement of weaving, the shuttle passing through the warp, the beater pressing the weft into place, the steady, repetitive motion, is one of the most ancient human activities, and it has a specific quality of meditative absorption. Your hands know what to do. Your mind is partially free. You can think or talk or simply exist in the rhythm. She is thinking this morning about a legal dispute. Because the people of Deir el-Medina were extraordinarily litigious. The same archive of ostraca that gives us the work absence records also gives us an astounding number of legal cases: disputes over property, inheritance, debt, stolen goods, unpaid wages, and interpersonal grievances of remarkable specificity. Ancient Egypt had a functioning legal system. Cases were heard by a local tribunal called the Kenbit, composed of respected community members, senior workers, scribes, foremen, who listened to both sides, examined evidence, and rendered judgments. Both men and women could bring cases and could serve as witnesses. Women could own property, conduct business, and appear in court on their own behalf, which was significantly more legal autonomy than many subsequent civilizations would grant them. The case Nefret is thinking about involves her neighbor Painab, who she believes stole several tools from the village storeroom, drank wine that was intended for a religious festival, sat on the stones covering a royal tomb, which was a serious religious offense, and seduced, or possibly assaulted, several women in the village, including a woman named Webkit. These accusations are not Nefret's imagination. They are documented in one of the most famous legal texts from Deir el-Medina, the suit against Painab, a papyrus that reads with the energy of a very detailed neighborhood drama and includes accusations against Painab that range from the petty stealing vegetables, to the serious tomb violation, to the genuinely alarming. Painab appears to have been the village catastrophe, the person everyone in every community has at some point experienced, the one who somehow keeps getting away with things, the one who makes everyone else's life slightly worse, the one who is eventually, after years of documented complaints, removed from his position as foreman. Nefret did not personally file the suit against Painab. Another man, Amenakhet, did that. But she knows what happened. Everyone in Deir el-Medina knows what happened, because Deir el-Medina is a small village, and everyone in a small village knows everything about everyone. She works the shuttle through the warp, and thinks about how the Kenbit ruled on the matter, and whether justice was adequately served, and whether Painab's removal from the foreman position was sufficient punishment for everything he'd done. She has opinions. Now let me tell you about the strike. The year is 1158 BC, about 120 years after the morning we have been watching in Nefret's house. The pharaoh is Ramesses II. Egypt is still the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, but the cracks are beginning to show. External pressures from the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of migrating groups who swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a wave, destroying the Hittite Empire and destabilizing everyone else, have stressed the Egyptian economy. Internal management has become complicated. Supply chains, which in the ancient world are a constant source of anxiety, have broken down. The workers of Deir el-Medina have not been paid. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Their rations, the bread, the grain, the fish, the beer, the various goods that constitute payment, have not arrived. The state has failed to deliver what it owes, and the workers, after waiting as long as they reasonably could, have decided they are not going to continue working until the debt is addressed. They put down their tools. They walked out of the Valley of the Kings. They marched to the mortuary temples on the West Bank and sat down and refused to leave until someone in authority addressed their situation. Their specific words, preserved in the record: "We have come here because of hunger and because of thirst. There is no clothing, there is no fish, there is no vegetables. Send to Pharaoh, our good lord, about it, and send to the vizier, our superior, that sustenance may be made for us." This is the oldest recorded labor strike in human history. 3,000 years before labor unions, before worker protections, before anyone had written down a theory of workers' rights, the men and women of Deir el-Medina organized, made demands, and refused to work until those demands were met. And it worked. The authorities, faced with a work stoppage at the most prestigious construction project in Egypt, scrambled to find rations and deliver them. The workers were paid. They went back to work. The same thing happened again the following month, because the supply problem was structural rather than incidental. But the point stands. When Egyptians couldn't eat, they said so loudly, and they had leverage because the pharaoh needed his tomb built, and the people building it knew it. Now imagine telling that to someone who believes ancient Egypt was built entirely on enslaved labor and fear. The picture is more complicated. It always is. Let me now take you inside a temple. Not the temple of Abu Simbel, with its 4 enormous seated Ramesses figures staring across the desert. That is for tourists and dramatic photographs. I want to take you inside an ordinary, working temple in an ordinary town and show you what it actually did all day. The Temple of Ancient Egypt. T was not primarily a place where ordinary people went to pray. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about Egyptian religion. The temple was not a community gathering space in the way that a church or a mosque or a synagogue is a community gathering space. It was the house of the god. More specifically, it was the residence of the god statue. The Egyptians believed that divine presence, a portion of the god's actual power and being, could inhabit a statue if the statue was properly consecrated. And once inhabited, that statue had to be treated exactly as a living divine being. Fed, clothed, washed, perfumed, entertained, put to bed at night, and woken in the morning with hymns. This was the job of the priests. Every day in every major Egyptian temple, a small group of specialists, the ritual priests, serving in rotating shifts, would approach the inner sanctuary, break the clay seal on the shrine doors, open them to reveal the divine statue within, and begin the elaborate ritual of caring for the god. The statue was unwrapped from its linen coverings, it was washed, it was anointed with oils, it was dressed in fresh linen and adorned with jewelry. Food offerings were placed before it: bread, beer, meat, vegetables, all the things a powerful divine being might require. Incense was burned. Hymns were sung. The statue was put in its specific position for the day's activities, whatever those might be. In the evening, the process was reversed. The food offerings were removed. The statue was redressed for night. The shrine doors were closed and resealed. The priest swept the floor of the sanctuary as he backed out, removing any trace of his footprints from the sacred space, because the only marks on the floor of the god's house should be the god's own marks. The food offerings, incidentally, did not go to waste. After they had been presented to the god, after the divine being had, in theological terms, consumed their spiritual essence, the physical food was redistributed. Priests ate well. Workers employed by the temple received portions. The temple economy was a significant redistribution mechanism in ancient Egyptian society, channeling resources from agricultural production through divine ritual back to the population. God's leftovers, still nutritious. The ordinary people of an Egyptian town had a more indirect relationship with their local temple than this daily ritual might suggest. They were not invited into the inner sanctuary. That space was for priests only. But they could approach the outer courts and temple gates to present petitions, leave offerings, pray in the more public spaces, and participate in festivals. And festivals were where Egyptian religion really came alive for ordinary people. Because on festival days, the god came out. The divine statue would be placed inside a special ceremonial boat, the sacred bark, and carried on the shoulders of priests out of the temple and through the streets. Sometimes the bark traveled to another temple to visit another god, in divine processions that combined religious ceremony with civic spectacle. People lined the streets to see the god pass. They could call out petitions. They could ask questions and receive oracular answers based on how the bark moved. If the priests carrying it moved forward, the answer was yes. If they moved backward, no. This was the Apit festival at Thebes, one of the most important religious events in the Egyptian calendar. The pharaoh traveling by boat with the bark of Amen from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, and back, over nearly a month, while the population celebrated along the banks of the Nile. Free food, free beer, music, dancing, the god passing through the streets, the pharaoh visible to his people, the whole civilization pausing to collectively affirm its relationship with the divine. Now compare that to any modern national holiday you can think of. The structure is remarkably similar. A shared symbol, a public gathering, food and music, a confirmation of collective identity. 3,000 years separates the Apit festival from a modern holiday parade, and the human need being met is identical. Let me take you back to Nefret, because the morning has passed and the afternoon has arrived, and the afternoon in ancient Egypt has its own character. She has been weaving since early morning, and her hands know the rhythm so well she has had 3 complete internal conversations, mentally resolved the pain of situation at least temporarily, and thought through what she needs from the market before the vendors pack up for the day. The market at Deir el-Medina was an informal affair, not a permanent marketplace with fixed stalls, but a regular gathering at which people exchanged goods. Since Egypt didn't use coins, everything was priced in a notional unit called the deben, a weight of copper, or sometimes silver or gold for larger transactions, and actual payments were made in whatever combination of goods reached the agreed value. A tunic might cost 5 deben, a pig might cost 10. Payment could be made in linen cloth, or in oil, or in grain, or in bronze tools, or in whatever you happen to have that the seller wanted. The ostraca from Deir el-Medina are full of these tiny economic transactions, and reading them feels like overhearing a flea market. I gave him 5 deben of copper for his goat. She gave me a wooden bed for my new clothing, and I gave her a mat and a pot in addition. He sold to me 1 cat in exchange for 5 deben of copper. That last one is historically notable. It is one of the earliest documented sales of a cat in history, which feels like the kind of thing that deserves acknowledgement. Nefret needs oil and a new ceramic pot for the kitchen. She carries a piece of linen cloth she finished last week, good quality, worth approximately 4 deben, and a small amount of grain. She will negotiate. The market vendors at Deir el-Medina know her and she knows them, which means the negotiations will be brief and mostly friendly, with the traditional initial assertion of outrage at the proposed price, followed by the swift arrival at an agreed number that both parties were always going to reach. Trade in ancient Egypt worked through relationships. Long-term buyers and sellers developed understandings. The deben provided a common language, but the actual exchange was human, eye contact, trust, reputation. This is not so different from shopping at a small market today, except that the linen cloth you're paying with was woven by your own hands, and the pot you're buying will last potentially hundreds of years, because Egyptian pottery is surprisingly durable. As she walks through the narrow village streets toward the market area, she passes the small shrines set into the walls of houses. Personal household religion was a significant part of Egyptian daily life. Beyond the formal temple cult, ordinary people maintained relationships with a whole range of protective deities and spirits. The goddess Taweret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, was the protector of pregnant women and childbirth. Bes, a fierce dwarf deity with a leonine face, protected households and children. Small clay figurines of these gods were kept in household niches, given food and flowers, addressed in informal prayers. The gods of daily life were not the same as the gods of the grand temples. Ra and Osiris were cosmic forces, theology, the machinery of the universe. Taweret and Bes were neighbors. They lived in your house. You could talk to them directly without going through a priest, without any formal ceremony. Just a word, a small offering, a moment of acknowledgement. This combination, cosmic theology plus household intimacy, gave Egyptian religion a particular texture. The universe was governed by enormous divine forces, and those forces also had smaller manifestations that sat in the corner of your kitchen and looked after your pregnant wife. Nefret passes one of the best shrines without stopping. She's in a hurry, but she notices it the way you notice a familiar face, a small nod of recognition that is not quite conscious and doesn't need to be. The market is just ahead. Let me pause here and take you to a different social stratum entirely. While Nefret negotiates for oil and pottery at the village market, let me introduce you to a man named Amenhotep, who lives approximately 40 kilometers to the north and whose daily life looks very different from anything we've seen so far. Amenhotep is a scribe. Not just any scribe. He is a senior administrative official in the regional granary system, one of the functionaries responsible for recording grain deliveries, tallying harvests, calculating taxes, overseeing storage, and managing the written records that kept the agricultural economy running. He is, by any reasonable measure, a member of the educated administrative class that made ancient Egypt function. Egypt ran on writing. Not just the elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions on temple walls, those were the formal, sacred register, used for religious and commemorative purposes. The day-to-day administration of the empire was conducted in hieratic, a cursive script derived from hieroglyphics that was faster to write and more suited to administrative work. And someone had to do the writing. The scribal class was not large. Literacy rates in ancient Egypt were low by modern standards. Estimates vary widely, but most scholars suggest somewhere between 1 and 10% of the population could read and write at a functional level. Scribes were trained from childhood in special schools attached to temples and administrative centers. The curriculum involved years of copying texts, model letters, moral teachings, mathematical problems, until the student could write quickly, accurately, and with enough elegance to reflect well on the administration they resented. Being a scribe was one of the most reliable paths to a comfortable life in ancient Egypt. It exempted you from heavy manual labor. It gave you access to administrative networks. It provided income and social status. And the Egyptians knew this. Scribal training texts are full of passages extolling the advantages of the scribe's life over various manual occupations. The scribe does not lack provisions or any good thing. How great and powerful is the scribe! He is not beaten like a soldier who is punished in public. This is actual ancient Egyptian propaganda for the scribal profession. It was written on papyrus and read aloud to students in scribal schools, presumably to motivate them through the years of repetitive copying practice. Now, this being Egypt, someone also carved the same speech into stone and put it on a stele in a temple, because once you have a good propaganda speech, you might as well make it permanent. Amenhotep's office, if we can call it that, is a room in the regional administrative complex, its walls lined with shelves holding rolled papyrus scrolls. The floor is tiled. There is a window, small and high, admitting a shaft of light that moves across the papyrus as the morning progresses. He sits cross-legged on a reed mat with a wooden palette holding cakes of ink, black carbon ink for regular text, red ochre ink for headings and important passages, and writes with a brush made from a reed, which he keeps sharp by chewing the end to a fine point. His work today involves the harvest tallies from 3 villages upstream, cross-checking the grain quantities against last year's records, identifying discrepancies, and writing a summary report for his superior. This is unglamorous work. It is accounting, but it is the kind of accounting on which civilization depends, because Egypt's ability to feed its population depended on accurately tracking how much grain existed, where it was, and how it was distributed. The Egyptians had government grain silos, enormous storage facilities managed by the state, and these silos were the food security of the empire. In good years, surplus grain went into storage. In bad years, it came back out. The state fed the workers who built the temples and tombs. The state paid the wages of the army. The state could, when the Nile failed to flood adequately, prevent famine by distributing reserves. This is why literacy mattered. You cannot manage a grain distribution system across a country hundreds of kilometers long without records. You cannot track debts and payments without writing. You cannot coordinate the labor of thousands of workers without scribes keeping the details in order. The pyramids and temples and colossal monuments of ancient Egypt are, in a real sense, made possible by a man like Amenhotep sitting in a modest room, cross-legged on a mat, chewing the end of his brush and adding numbers in the margin. He finishes the column. He makes a note about a discrepancy in the records from the southern village. Someone has underreported by approximately 30 sacks of grain, which will require investigation. He dips his brush in the red ink and marks the passage. Then he stands up, stretches, and walks to the window. From here, he can see the river, a flash of light between the buildings of the town, the broad brown gleam of the Nile moving steadily north. He can see the farming fields on the near bank, still green with the last of the growing season's crops before the flood comes to take them. He can see, distantly, the shapes of the eastern desert hills on the horizon, and above them the sky, which in Egypt at midday in summer is a color of blue so deep and so total that it seems less like weather and more like an architectural feature. He stays at the window for a moment longer than he needs to. Then he goes back to his mat and picks up his brush. Now let me tell you about medicine, because ancient Egyptian medicine is one of the most fascinating and most misunderstood topics in the whole field of Egyptology, and it deserves a longer conversation than it usually gets. The common assumption is that ancient medicine was entirely magical, spells and prayers and superstitions, with no actual medical knowledge. And while spells and prayers were certainly part of Egyptian medical practice, the reality is significantly more interesting. Egypt had written medical texts. Several of them survive. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Ebers Papyrus, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. These documents preserve actual medical knowledge. Lists of conditions, diagnoses, recommended treatments, prognoses. And while some of this knowledge was magical in character, a significant portion of it was what we would recognize as rational empirical medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is particularly remarkable. Dated to around 1600 BC, but believed to be based on much older sources, it describes 48 cases of physical injuries, wounds to the head, and neck and chest, fractures, dislocations, and provides diagnosis and treatment recommendations for each one. The format is strikingly modern. Examination of condition, diagnosis, specific description, prognosis. A disease I will treat, a disease I will contend with / a disease not to be treated. The third category, conditions the physician recognizes as beyond treatment, represents an ancient medical ethic of honesty that is, frankly, impressive. The medical knowledge includes cleaning and bandaging wounds, proper treatment of fractures using wooden splints, descriptions of the brain and its injury effects that show genuine observation, specific treatments for various infections and inflammations. There was also a great deal of magical medicine, spells against scorpion stings, prayers to specific gods for healing, rituals conducted alongside medical treatments. This was not ignorance. This was a worldview in which the physical and the spiritual were not separate categories. A fever was both a physical condition and a divine communication, and treating it required addressing both dimensions. The physician of ancient Egypt occupied a specific professional role, distinct from the priest, though sometimes the same person could be both, and trained practitioners were available at different levels of Egyptian society. There were royal physicians attached to the palace, and there were local healers available to ordinary people, and there was probably a spectrum of quality between the two extremes. Back in Deir el-Medina, a woman named Meretra, who lives 3 houses down from Nefret, is one of the people most people consult when someone is sick. She is not a physician in the formal sense. She has not been trained at a temple school, and she does not use the formal language of the medical papyri. What she has is 30 years of practical experience with the health problems of her small community, an extensive knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties, and a particular skill with the treatments for eye problems, which are common in the Nile Valley, where flies and dust and the intense sunlight conspire to make eye infections a near-constant presence. She is also the person you go to for childbirth assistance, which in the ancient world was an exclusively female domain. Childbirth happened at home, with the mother supported by female relatives and a midwife, in a specific posture using a birthing brick, a pair of special bricks the mother knelt on, with prayers and spells and specific rituals to protect both mother and child. Childhood mortality was significant. The Egyptian texts are full of it. The spells to protect newborns, the prayers against infant illness, the amulets hung around cradles, all represent the anxiety of parents who knew perfectly well that a healthy baby was not a guarantee but a hope. The ones who survived early childhood tended to grow up reasonably healthy. Egyptian mummy analysis shows that the adult population in the New Kingdom era generally ate adequately, worked physically hard, had dental problems from the gritty bread, suffered from parasites from the Nile water, and died at average ages that seem short by modern standards but were reasonably consistent with what we see in pre-industrial populations throughout history. They were, in other words, human, complex, mortal, worried about their children, doing their best with what they had. Meretra is currently treating the scribe Ka, Nefret's husband, for an eye infection he picked up in the tomb, working by lamplight in underground spaces where air circulation was poor meant that tomb workers often developed respiratory and eye problems. Ka's right eye has been red and swollen for 3 days. She mixes a paste of copper compounds and honey, a treatment that modern research has confirmed has actual antibacterial properties, and applies it carefully to the affected eye. She says a short prayer to the healing God segment while she does it. The copper paste and the prayer are not separate activities to her. They are the same activity. She is treating the physical problem and the spiritual dimension simultaneously because she does not experience them as different. Ka tolerates this with the patience of someone who has been through it before. He works with his eyes. He needs his eyes. He cannot afford to let this get worse. After Muratra leaves, he sits in the back room of his house in the dimming afternoon light and thinks about the section of the tomb he was working on when the infection began. A scene of Osiris receiving the dead pharaoh, the weighing of the heart, the feather of Maat balanced on the scales. He had been working on the crocodile head of Ammon, the beast who waits to devour hearts found too heavy. He had been drawing a monster's mouth, and now his eye hurt. He does not make the connection, but he does think it is an awkward coincidence. Let me tell you about the aft. Life, because this is the subject that defined Egyptian civilization more than any other, and understanding how ordinary Egyptians thought about death changes everything about how you understand how they lived. The ancient Egyptian belief in the afterlife was not a vague, poetic hope. It was a detailed, specific, carefully maintained technological project. The Egyptians did not hope for survival after death. They engineered it. Every pyramid, every tomb, every mummified body, every amulet placed in the wrappings, every spell written on papyrus and tucked into the burial, every elaborate painting of the judgment scene on the tomb walls. All of it was practical preparation for the continuation of life in a specific form, in a specific place, with specific requirements. The field of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife, was described as an idealized version of the Nile Valley. Green fields, abundant crops, cool water, the familiar pleasures of earthly life, but permanent. Not transformed into something unrecognizable, not dissolved into light or bliss, but continuous. You would still be you. You would still know the people you loved. You would still eat bread and drink beer and watch the sunrise. But to get there, you had to navigate a very specific set of requirements. You had to preserve the body. This is the reason for mummification, not ritual but practical. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul had several components, among them the Ba, something like the personality or individual identity, and the Ka, something like the life force. After death, these components needed to be able to return to the body, and they could only do this if the body was recognizable. A decomposed body was a lost person. So the Egyptians developed mummification technology over centuries, eventually reaching a level of sophistication that preserved bodies recognizably for thousands of years. We can look at the face of Ramesses II today and see the man. You had to have your name spoken. The Egyptians believed that a person's name was part of their identity, and that having your name spoken aloud helped maintain your existence in the afterlife. This is why names appear so frequently in tombs and inscriptions, not vanity but insurance. If someone said your name, you were still real. The most terrible thing that could happen to a person after death was to have their name erased, their images defaced, their memory obliterated. This was the second death, the true death from which there was no return. You had to have provisions. The food and drink and furniture buried in the tomb were not symbols. They were the actual supplies for the afterlife, initially, and then later pictures of supplies, because the magic of Egyptian funerary tradition held that a depicted offering was as effective as a real one, which was pragmatically useful as it turned out to be significantly cheaper than actually burying a full inventory of physical goods with every deceased person. You had to pass judgment. The weighing of the heart before Osiris was the final qualification exam. A life of Maat, of truth, balance, justice, compassion was required. The heart had to be light. The negative confession spoken before the 42 assessor gods listed all the wrongs a person had not committed. I have not stolen, I have not killed anyone. I have not committed fraud. I have not been greedy. I have not been deaf to truth. I have not caused suffering. 42 Denials, a comprehensive moral audit. What strikes modern readers about the negative confession is how recognizable it is. Many of the things listed are wrongs that any society at any time would recognize as wrongs. Theft, violence, fraud, cruelty. The Egyptian moral framework, developed 3,000 years ago, identifies the same basic failures as the moral frameworks of societies thousands of years later. The specific forms change. The underlying categories don't. Now, the reality of Egyptian burial for ordinary people was much less elaborate than the royal version. A pharaoh got a pyramid or a rock-cut tomb, an enormous investment of labor and resources, decorated chambers, multiple coffins, a mummy wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen with amulets at every joint. An ordinary worker in Deir el-Medina got a modest rock-cut tomb in the hillside cemetery, a coffin of good quality if the family could afford it, a collection of amulets, some pottery vessels of food and beer, and the same spells from the Book of the Dead painted on the coffin or written on papyrus and tucked inside. The spells mattered because they were navigation instructions. The underworld was not a simple place. It had gates, guardians, and challenges that required specific magical knowledge to pass. The Book of the Dead was essentially a guidebook. If you had it, and if your tomb was properly decorated, you had a fighting chance of making it to the field of reeds. And if you couldn't afford a written book of Dead, because papyrus was not cheap and scribes charged for their services, there were community versions available at reduced cost, standardized texts that left blanks for the individual's name. You bought the book, a scribe filled in your name, and you went into the afterlife equipped. Even the death industry in ancient Egypt had economy pricing. The cemetery at Deir el-Medina climbs up the hillside above the village in neat rows of small tomb chapels, their whitewashed facades visible from the village below. Walking through it today, the proximity of the living and the dead that characterized ancient Egyptian communities is immediately apparent. These are not graves hidden away from sight. They are buildings, small but permanent, set into the landscape of daily life. You walked past your grandparents' tomb on the way to the market. Your children played in view of your parents' chapel. The dead were not elsewhere. They were here nearby, part of the ongoing community. The annual festival of the valley, when Amun's bark crossed the river to the west bank and visited the tombs, was a time when families picnicked at their relatives' tombs, sharing food and beer with the dead, maintaining the connection across whatever boundary death represented. This is, when you think about it, a profoundly healthy relationship with mortality. The dead were not erased. They were remembered, fed, talked to, included. They remained part of the family even after death. The living and the dead sat together in the sun, sharing lunch, on the west bank of the Nile, with the desert hills above and the river below, and the living city of Thebes visible across the water. You might find that strange. Or you might find it, depending on how you feel about your own dead, rather beautiful. Let me take you to the river itself for a moment. Because we have been on the banks, in the village, in the administrative offices, in the tombs, and it is time to get on the water. The Nile was not just the backdrop of ancient Egyptian civilization, it was the highway. In a country where the terrain on both sides of the river was largely desert, where roads were limited and overland travel was slow and expensive, the river was the primary transportation network. Everything moved by boat: grain, stone, timber, cattle, people, armies, the divine statues of the gods traveling between temples during festivals, and the enormous blocks of granite and limestone that built the monuments. The Egyptians were exceptional boat builders. They had to be. River navigation was different from ocean navigation. The Nile ran in one direction, and the prevailing north wind blew in the other, which the Egyptians turned into an elegant practical system. You sailed south using the wind. You floated north using the current. This is why the Egyptian hieroglyph for going north shows a boat with no sail, and the hieroglyph for going south shows a boat with its sail up. The Nile was full of traffic: papyrus skiffs used by fishermen and duck hunters in the marshes, wooden trading boats carrying goods between towns, large cargo vessels transporting grain to the government storehouses, royal barges traveling in state, military vessels, ferries crossing from east to west bank, and the sacred barks, the ceremonial boats on which the gods traveled during festivals, which were sometimes actual watercraft and sometimes carried on poles on the shoulders of priests. Fishing was a significant industry and a significant part of the diet. The Nile and its delta carried enormous quantities of fish, and images of fishing, with nets, with spears, with hooks, appear throughout tomb paintings as both practical documentation and symbolic imagery. A man fishing from a papyrus skiff in a marsh was a common motif, sometimes used to represent leisure and enjoyment, sometimes used in a more complex symbolic sense as a metaphor for the journey through the underworld. Hunting in the marshes was similarly documented. Wealthy Egyptians, and the tomb paintings are primarily about wealthy Egyptians, which distorts our picture somewhat, are depicted standing in papyrus reed boats, throwing sticks at waterfowl, while cats supposedly assist in the hunt. Whether cats actually helped catch birds or were simply brought along because their owners liked them is a question that remains, charmingly, open. What we know definitively is that the Egyptians had a deep affection for cats. Cats appear in Egyptian art from very early periods. They were associated with the goddess Bastet. They were kept in homes. When a household cat died, family members shaved their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. The cat cemetery at the Temple of Bastet at Bubastis held hundreds of thousands of mummified cats, which is both a testament to religious devotion and a reminder that Egyptians took even small-scale death seriously. The penalty for killing a cat in ancient Egypt, according to Herodotus, was death. Whether this was rigorously enforced is uncertain, but the general principle that cats were protected animals with significant religious status is well documented. When modern people learn this, there is inevitably a warm response, because cats have maintained their special position in human affection across the entire intervening millennia without any apparent effort on their part. And the idea that the ancient Egyptians understood this particular truth about the world is comforting. Let me now go to the court of Ramesses II, because while we have been following the modest daily life of Deir el-Medina, something significant is happening at the top of the political structure that will eventually filter down to everyone. It is approximately the year 1274 BC. Egypt is not at peace. To the north, the Hittite Empire, based in what is now central Turkey, controls Syria and Palestine and is pushing steadily south. Ramesses II, 3 years into his reign, has decided this is unacceptable. He has assembled an army of approximately 20,000 men, organized into 4 divisions named after the gods Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set, and is marching north to deal with the Hittite king Muwatalli II at a city called Kadesh on the Orontes River. The Battle of Kadesh is one of the most thoroughly documented military engagements of the ancient world, primarily because Ramesses II was extremely interested in how posterity would remember it. He commissioned multiple accounts of the battle, narrative texts describing the action, shorter bullet-point versions called the Bulletin, and enormous wall carvings at temples from Abu Simbel to Karnak to Luxor. Here is what the inscriptions say happened. Ramesses, misled by false intelligence provided by Hittite spies, advanced to Kadesh with only the Amun division close by, the other 3 divisions strung out behind him along the road. The Hittites ambushed the Ra division, scattered it, and attacked the Amun division's camp. Ramesses found himself surrounded, his army in chaos, his situation desperate. He personally charged the enemy again and again, essentially alone, while his officers fled in panic around him. He appealed to the god Amun. He was invincible. He won the battle single-handed. This is the Egyptian account. The Hittite account says they won. The realistic reconstruction by modern historians suggests that the battle was probably a tactical draw. Neither side achieved its strategic objectives. The Hittites didn't break through. Ramesses didn't capture Kadesh. Both armies survived. Both sides claimed victory. What followed was approximately 16 years of continued conflict, border skirmishing, and diplomatic maneuvering, which eventually ended in what historians consider the world's earliest surviving peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, negotiated around 1258 BC, in which Egypt and the Hittites agreed to end hostilities, respect each other's territories, and crucially, maintain a mutual defense pact. Both sides carved the treaty on the walls of their respective archives. A copy hangs today in the lobby of the United Nations building in New York, because it represents one of the first formal international agreements in recorded history. Ramesses also, in a subsequent diplomatic gesture, married a Hittite princess. He then renamed her with an Egyptian name, Mot-Horneferir, and she joined the extensive population of the royal harem. On one of the temples, Ramesses had carved an inscription describing the Hittite king as his brother. The text notes that the princess arrived in Egypt and that Ramesses found her beautiful, and that everything was harmonious between the two great powers. Whether the Hittite princess found her new situation harmonious is not recorded. She would not have been asked. Back in the real world, the world of Deir el-Medina and market transactions and weaving and bread, the consequences of this international diplomacy arrived slowly and indirectly. More stability on the northern border meant the military was less demanding of resources. The grain supply remained manageable. The pyramid complex kept running. The workers got paid. Most of the time. Until, as we have already noted, they sometimes didn't. Let me now take you to a scene that the ostraca from Deir el-Medina paint with remarkable vividness: the village at night. The Egyptian day was organized around the sun in the most literal possible way. You worked during daylight. You rested when it was dark. Artificial lighting existed, oil lamps and torches, but they were expensive in oil and materials, and most ordinary households would not have used them extensively for anything beyond the basic requirements of moving around the house after dark. The specific quality of Egyptian nights was shaped by the desert. Without the moisture that softens darkness in wetter climates, the sky over the Egyptian desert is extraordinary, the stars more numerous and brighter than almost anywhere else on Earth, the Milky Way a physical presence rather than a vague smear, the planets clearly visible and tracked and named and incorporated into the religious system that organized everything else. The Egyptians watched the sky with real attention. They tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius Sopdet to the Egyptians, which heralded the beginning of the Nile flood season and was used as the basis for the Egyptian calendar year. They identified and named specific stars and star groups. They built temples aligned with astronomical precision, so that at specific times of year, sunlight or starlight entered specific chambers and illuminated specific features. This was not superstition. It was practical timekeeping combined with religious meaning, the same combination that produces modern calendars, which also assign significance to days based on a mix of astronomical events and cultural tradition. Nefret in the evening sits outside her front door with a neighbor. The children are inside or playing nearby. The day's work is largely done. The heat that made the afternoon oppressive has retreated with the sun, and the desert evening is cooling rapidly in the way that desert evenings do, from intolerable to pleasant to eventually, well after midnight, genuinely cold. They talk. What do people talk about in the evening? In Deir el-Medina specifically, and in ancient Egypt generally, the evidence suggests roughly what people have always talked about everywhere: work, neighbors, the latest news, who is sick, who is arguing with whom, what the foreman said at the site today, the rising flood level and what it might mean for next year's crops, the latest legal case before the Kenbit. Painab and his seemingly inexhaustible ability to cause problems. Also gossip. The ostraca of Deir el-Medina include love poems, short, passionate, elegant texts in which a young man describes his beloved in terms drawn from nature and longing. She is compared to a lotus flower. Her voice is described as honey. His heart beats faster when he sees her. He cannot eat or sleep for thinking of her. These poems are approximately 3,000 years old. They read exactly like contemporary romantic poetry. Human longing does not change. The vocabulary changes. The cultural references change. The specific name of the girl or boy changes. The meter of the verse changes. But the feeling underneath, the helpless, particular, consuming experience of romantic desire, is recognizable across 3 millennia without modification. Ancient Egyptians fell in love. They wrote poems about it. Some of those poems survived because they were written on fragments of pottery and limestone that happened to persist in the desert archive of Deir el-Medina, and now we can read them. There is something quietly moving about this. The neighbor's husband arrives home from work, dusty from the valley, and the evening conversation reconfigures around him. Food is brought out, leftover stew, bread, onions, water, and beer. The desert sky above the village is turning the color of deep blue and then darker, and the stars are beginning to come out one by one, the way stars appear in dry, clear air, gradually but then suddenly all at once. The children are called in. The lamps are lit. The day winds down. Let me take you to the temples one more time before we close, because I want to show you something about Egyptian architecture that most people don't think about. The temples were not just religious buildings, they were banks. Specifically, they were the storage and redistribution centers of Egypt's agricultural economy. The temple estates were enormous landholdings. The estate of Amen at Karnak alone, at its peak, controlled enormous amounts of farmland, cattle, workers, and stored goods. The income from this land flowed into the temple, where it was managed by the priestly administration, used to fund temple operations, and redistributed to temple personnel and workers. In a country without coined money, the temple was the closest thing to a financial institution. Large transactions were conducted in weights of copper or silver, but the real wealth of Egypt moved through the grain and the linen and the cattle and the oil that flowed in and out of temple storerooms. This gave the priestly class significant economic power alongside their religious authority. By the later periods of Egyptian history, particularly during the Third Intermediate Period, after the New Kingdom ended, the high priests of Amen would become politically powerful enough to effectively co-rule Upper Egypt alongside, and sometimes against, the pharaoh. The combination of religious authority and economic control is a pattern that appears in many civilizations throughout history. Whoever controls the storerooms controls a very great deal. But in 1280 BC, the system is still in relative balance. The pharaoh is the pharaoh, the priests serve him, the work. Urs build his monuments, the scribes record the details, the farmers grow the crops, the river floods and recedes, the grain goes into the silos and comes back out again, the sun rises and sets. The civilization continues. Let me tell you about the children. Because we have been focusing on adults, working adults with responsibilities and problems, and children in ancient Egypt deserve their own attention. Egyptian children are remarkably well documented, partly through the ostraca of Deir el-Medina, partly through tomb paintings, partly through the staggering quantity of children's toys and amulets that archaeologists have recovered. The toys are wonderful. Wooden pull toys in the shape of animals, with jointed jaws that opened and closed as the toy was pulled along. Clay balls, spinning tops, dolls made of cloth and wood with real human hair, small wooden boats, miniature kitchen sets, balls braided from palm leaves or made from leather stuffed with grain husks. Egyptian children played the same games that children play everywhere. They ran and chased and wrestled. The tomb paintings at Deir el-Medina and other sites show children playing tug-of-war, playing what appears to be a precursor to leapfrog, playing ball games, and doing the kind of general energetic physical play that looks identical to the same activities in any modern schoolyard. There are also in the ostraca fragments of children's school exercises, the practice texts where young scribes in training copied model sentences again and again until their writing improved. The mistakes are visible. The letters are unsteady. The line goes slightly crooked. You can see a child trying. Education in ancient Egypt was primarily oral and apprenticeship-based for most of the population. Formal scribal training was available to a minority, but the basic transmission of knowledge, how to farm, how to weave, how to cook, how to navigate the river, how to care for the sick, how to observe the sky, happened in every household, from parent to child, in the ordinary daily practice of living. Nefret's daughter Ipit, learning to bake and to make eye paint in the early morning, is receiving an education. It is not written on papyrus. It does not have a formal name, but it is as sophisticated, in its own way, as anything being taught in the scribal schools of the royal administration, and it will equip her for the specific life she is going to live. The transmission of practical knowledge from generation to generation, the passing on of the skills and wisdom and specific understanding that make daily life possible, is the foundation on which every civilization rests. The pyramids and the temples are the visible peak. The early morning baking lesson is the invisible base. Both matter. Now let me take you to the end of the day. The sun is going down behind the western hills, the desert ridge behind Deir el-Medina, where the Valley of the Kings lies hidden. The light on the limestone cliffs turns orange, then red, then the deep rose of a desert sunset, which in Egypt has a specific quality of beauty that travelers still describe as unlike anything else on earth. This is not accident. The Egyptians noticed it too. The western horizon, the direction of the setting sun, the direction of the dead, was sacred. The west bank of the Nile was where the cemeteries were, where the Valley of the Kings was, where the mortuary temples were built to serve the dead pharaohs. The east bank was the living city, the east horizon where Ra was born each morning. The west was where the day ended and the dead lived. Every evening, the sun set over the tombs. And from the windows of the village, and from the river banks, and from the market and the temples and the fields, the people of this civilization watched it go down and must have felt the specific, daily reminder that the world runs on cycles. That endings are also beginnings, that the sun will come back. Ka comes home from the valley with his infected eye slightly better. The copper paste has helped. He smells of lamp oil and stone dust. He sits on the ground in the small courtyard and accepts a piece of bread from Ipit, who brings it to him with the particular serious care that children reserve for the people they love when those people are not entirely well. He eats the bread slowly. Nefret comes and sits beside him. They watch the last of the light leave the cliff tops above them. They do not say anything significant, at least not anything that gets written on ostraca. They are tired in the specific, satisfying way of people who have worked physically all day. The village is settling around them. The sounds of households, children, animals, cooking fires, the ambient music of a community in the last hours of daylight. The star Sirius will rise later tonight. Nefret knows this because the priests announced it yesterday, and the announcement means the flood is perhaps 3 weeks away. He should check the grain storage. She should talk to her husband about the harvest and about whether the bread supply will last. She should settle the question of Ipit's future, which is beginning to feel urgent. She makes a mental note of all of it. Then she lets it go for now. The evening is too good for calculations. Across the river, the living city of Thebes hums in the twilight. The temples glow with lamplight. The river reflects the last colors of the sky. The world is immeasurably old and somehow still new, still here, still doing what it has always done. The flood is coming. The fields will die and be reborn. The grain will grow in the dark silt, left by the retreating water. The children will learn what their parents knew. The dead will be fed and remembered in the hillside tombs above the village. The sun will come back. It always comes back. And 3,000 years later, someone is going to find a piece of pottery in the sand, and it will have a love poem on it, in a clear, elegant hand, describing a girl whose voice was like honey and whose presence made thinking impossible. And that someone will hold the pottery fragment in their hands and read the words and feel something very particular and familiar and human. And that, in the end, is what ancient Egypt is. Not the pyramids, not the hieroglyphs, not the pharaohs, not the golden masks. Those are the architecture. The inside, the thing the architecture was protecting, the thing it was built to celebrate and preserve, was exactly what we've been following all morning. A woman making bread before dawn. A man drawing a monster's mouth by lamplight. A child learning her mother's hands. A community of workers going on strike because they hadn't been paid. A scribe adding numbers in the margin. Two people sitting in a courtyard watching the last light leave the cliffs. The most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever seen. Built on bread and beer, and the gift of the river and 30 centuries of patient, determined human persistence. And now you know where the pyramids came from. Sleep well tonight. The flood is coming, but there's time yet. Thank you for spending this evening in ancient Egypt with dull tales. If this kind of long, slow, comfortable walk through the past is something you look forward to, please subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep going. Hit like. Leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever been to Egypt or if you want to go or what you found most surprising tonight. Did you know about the strike, the love poems, the economy pricing on afterlife equipment? I want to know what landed. Next time we go to Rome. Not the empire, not the legions, not Caesar. The other Rome. The one where someone is always yelling about vegetables at the market, and the apartment building is definitely on fire again, and the gladiator who just won is thinking about what to have for dinner. But that's next time. For now, the western cliffs are dark. The stars are out over Deir el-Medina. Somewhere in a small courtyard, two tired people are watching the sky. Good night. Let me take you somewhere we haven't been yet. Let me take you to the school. Not the scribal school of the administrative elite. We spent time with Amenhotep and his ink cakes, and that world is well documented. I want to take you to the more informal educational world of ordinary Egyptian children, because the way a civilization transmits knowledge to its next generation tells you more about its values than almost anything else. In the villages and towns along the Nile, most children receive their education through apprenticeship. Boys learn their father's trade, farming, pottery, carpentry, weaving, stone-cutting, fishing, by working alongside adults from a young age. Girls learn domestic management, including everything from food preparation to medical knowledge to the care of children, from their mothers and grandmothers and the network of experienced women in the community. This was not a lesser education. In a world where most knowledge was practical and experiential rather than textual, learning by doing was the primary pedagogy. A boy who spent 5 years working beside a master stonecutter knew things about stone that could not be learned from any papyrus, because papyrus could not show you how the tool vibrated slightly differently depending on the grain of the rock, or how to read the shadows that told you whether the surface was level, or the specific angle of the wrist that prevented the chisel from slipping. The trade schools were the body itself. But the scribal schools deserve their own attention, because they produced the literate class that made the Egyptian state function, and what they taught and how they taught it tells us something interesting about what the Egyptians valued. The core curriculum of the scribal school involved copying, thousands of lines of copying. Students copied moral texts, compilations of wise advice about how to behave in the world, and model letters showing proper administrative correspondence, and literary works including narrative stories and mathematical problems. The instruction of Amenemhat, the maxims of Ptahhotep, the satire of the trades. These were the texts Egyptian schoolboys copied until their hands cramped, and reading them today is strange and intimate in equal measure, strange because they are 3,000 years old, and intimate because the advice in them is entirely recognizable. The maxims of Ptahhotep, attributed to a vizier who lived during the Old Kingdom period, contains advice that reads like a very ancient self-help book. Do not be proud of your knowledge. Consult the ignorant and the wise alike. Do not enter into a house of another without being told to. It is not your place. If you are powerful, make yourself respected through knowledge and by means of your ability. How hard and painful are the hours of one who is old and decrepit, who complains about everything, who is unable to judge what is good or bad. That last one was written approximately 4,500 years ago. It describes the experience of aging with a precision that would fit in any contemporary piece of writing. The specific texture of old age, the difficulty of judgment, the constant complaint, the exhausted evaluation of everything, was apparently identical 35 centuries ago to what it is today. The scribal students who copied this text probably found it tedious. They were copying moral advice about respecting elders and keeping your house tidy, and they were 12 years old, and there were 1,000 lines to go. But somewhere in the copying, something landed, a phrase that stuck, an observation that matched something they had already noticed about the world. This is how education has always worked, even when it looked like nothing more than tedious repetition. Now let me take you to the market in a slightly larger city, not Deir el-Medina's village exchange, but the marketplace of a regional town, the kind of semi-urban commercial hub that Egypt had in abundance along the Nile. The market is noisy in the way that markets in warm climates and dense populations are always noisy, overlapping voices, animals, the creak of cartwheels on stone, the smell of food and people and river mud, and the specific sweetness that comes from ripe dates in warm air. Compare this to a modern street market anywhere in the Mediterranean or the Middle East, and the sensory experience would not be entirely foreign. The goods would be different. The language would be utterly alien. But the human behavior, the negotiation, the display of goods, the social gathering around commerce, would be immediately recognizable. A man named Sennacherib is selling fish today. He is not the same Sennacherib whose tomb at Deir el-Medina contains some of the most beautiful paintings in the necropolis. That Sennacherib lived and died sometime around 1279 BC, and his painted burial chamber survives intact today, preserved so well that when archaeologists opened it in 1886, the food offerings placed inside it were still recognizable as food. But our Sennacherib shares a name, as many Egyptians shared names, and he sells the tilapia and perch he catches in the river from a low stall near the waterfront. He has been a fisherman for 20 years. He knows the river the way a person knows a complicated relative, its moods and rhythms, its predictable behaviors and its occasional alarming surprises. He knows which stretches of water produce fish at which times of year. He knows which weather patterns mean the fish are running deep or shallow. He knows the signs of the flood coming and the flood receding with an accuracy that no written calendar could improve on. His fish are fresh, which matters enormously in a pre-refrigeration world. He pulled them from the river this morning, in the gray pre-dawn while the rest of the market was still sleeping. The cold water of the early morning kept them in reasonable condition for the journey to the stall. By midday, in the summer heat, freshness would become a serious concern. He will sell everything by late morning or salt and dry whatever is left. The woman buying from him is negotiating hard. She wants 10 fish for the price of 8. He wants to sell all 10 fish for the price of 10 fish, because mathematics works the same in 1280 BC as it does now. They are both performing the script that every market negotiation has always followed. Initial outrage, patient reduction, apparent grudging compromise, genuine satisfaction on both sides at having reached the inevitable middle point that both of them knew from the start was where this was going. She gets 9 fish for the price of 8.5 in oil. He makes his daily target. Both are satisfied. Egypt, in this sense, was not so different from the commercial world it spawned, the market logic that began in these Nile side exchanges, barter transformed into standard value units, complex transactions governed by reputation and relationship, the intersection of supply and demand managed by negotiation, would eventually evolve through the Persian period and the Ptolemaic period and the Roman period into the monetary economy of the ancient Mediterranean and then the modern world. Every currency, every stock market, every commercial transaction has an ancestor in a fisherman and a woman arguing about the price of tilapia on the banks of the Nile. Let me go back to Ramesses, because I want to tell you something about him that the official monuments don't include. He was, by any objective assessment, extraordinary at self-promotion. The temples of Ramesses II are covered, completely covered in carvings and inscriptions that describe his virtues, his victories, his divine favor, and his general magnificence. At Abu Simbel, 4 60-foot statues of himself guard the entrance to the temple. Inside, the walls show Ramesses smiting enemies, Ramesses receiving divine blessing, Ramesses at the Battle of Kadesh, and in case you missed the message, Ramesses, once more, being magnificent. He also, as noted, had a habit of carving his name over monuments built by his predecessors. The technique was simple. You chiseled a new cartouche over the old one, and the monument became yours. Egyptologists call this usurpation, and Ramesses was its most enthusiastic practitioner. What is particularly amusing about this is that his usurpations were sometimes so obvious, carved in shallow relief over deep-cut originals, meaning the original name was still visible underneath, that even his contemporaries must have noticed. It is possible they were too polite to say anything, or possible that nobody mentioned it to the pharaoh, because mentioning an awkward truth to someone with the power of divine authority was not a career-enhancing move. The point is, Ramesses II was human, a phenomenally powerful, genuinely remarkable, probably exhausting human, but a human. He worried about his legacy. He wanted to be remembered. He built the biggest things he could build and carved his name on them as many times as he could manage, and every pharaoh before and after him did the same thing in their own ways. This is not a criticism. It is, if anything, endearing. The most powerful ruler in the ancient world had the same basic anxiety as anyone who has ever put their name on a building or a scholarship or a product. I was here. Remember me. The difference is that Ramesses had 67 years on the throne and an empire's resources at his disposal. And so his version of Remember Me included 4 60-foot statues and a peace treaty that still hangs in the United Nations. Most of us will have to make do with less. Now let me take you to a moment that probably happened 10,000 times in ancient Egypt, and that nobody recorded because it was ordinary, which makes it, in its own way, precious. It is evening at Deir el-Medina. The village is settling into the cool after the day's heat. A man, we'll call him Nebwenenef, a name attested in the village records, is sitting in the doorway of his house watching the last light on the cliff tops. He is a plasterer. He prepares the smooth white coating on tomb walls that allows the artists like Ka to draw on them. His work is the literal foundation on which the famous paintings rest, not glamorous, not celebrated in any inscription, but absolutely essential. He has been doing this work for 15 years. His hands are permanently stained with lime plaster. His arms are strong from the mixing. His knees ache in a particular way from kneeling on stone floors in low-ceiling chambers. He has probably inhaled more plaster dust than is ideal, and his lungs would confirm this if they could speak. But the pay is regular. The community is good. His children are healthy. His wife, who is sharper and funnier than he deserves, he thinks this himself, with a genuine admiration that has survived 15 years of marriage, is inside making dinner and arguing with the youngest about whether he has actually washed his face or just wetted his hair and hoped nobody would look closely. This argument, audible from the doorway, makes him smile. He looks at the cliff top. The last light is exactly the color of the inside of an apricot, warm and deep and specific in the way that colors at the edge of darkness always are, the world making one last effort to be beautiful before it gives up for the night. He thinks about nothing in particular. He is 38 years old, and his back hurts, and his children are arguing about whether their faces are clean enough, and he is sitting in the last warmth of a day in ancient Egypt, and nothing about this moment is recorded anywhere, and nothing about it needs to be. It just is. It was 3,000 years ago, in a village built to house the workers who built the tombs of the gods. A man sat in his doorway and watched the light fade from the desert cliffs, and felt whatever he felt, and the feeling was real, and the feeling was human, and the feeling is gone now in its specific form but not gone in its general form, because people are still sitting in doorways and watching light fade from things, and feeling whatever they feel. This continuity, this unbroken thread of human experience that runs from the earliest tool users through every civilization to the present moment, is what history is actually about, when you strip away the dynasties and the battles and the monumental inscriptions. Not the pharaohs, not the monuments, not even the strike. Just the man in the doorway. The apricot light. The sound of children arguing about whether their faces are clean. This is ancient Egypt. This is what it was. This is what it always was underneath everything else. Now let me bring you slowly back to the present. Because we have been in 1280 BC for a while now, in the village, on the river, in the palace, in the tomb, and it is time to make the crossing back to tonight, to wherever you are, to this room and this hour and this warmth. Ancient Egypt lasted approximately 3,000 years. Let that number settle for a moment. 3,000 years. From the first dynasty, around 3100 BC, to the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, Egypt was continuous. It changed enormously over that time, different capitals, different dynasties, different foreign influences absorbed and adapted and Egyptianized. But it was recognizably Egypt throughout. For comparison, from tonight, going backward 3,000 years, you arrive approximately at the time of Nefret and Ka and Ramesses II. Going forward 3,000 years from tonight puts you somewhere around the year 5000 AD, which is more future than most people are comfortable imagining. Ancient Egypt's duration was that long. It ran for as long forward from the pyramids as the pyramids are behind us right now. Think about that. And through all of that time, through all the dynasties and the invasions and the periods of chaos and the periods of glory, ordinary people continued making bread before dawn, arguing about prices at the market, worrying about their children, going on strike when they weren't paid, writing love poems on pieces of pottery, feeding their dead at the cemetery, sitting in doorways, watching the light change on the cliffs. The monuments are impressive. The mummies are remarkable, the gods are fascinating, but the bread is what sustains you, and the bread has always been the same bread: emmer wheat, water, a little fermentation, the heat of a clay oven, hands that know the feel of the dough without measuring anything. Nefret is still baking that bread in every kitchen where someone wakes up early and makes something for the people they love before the day has properly started. Ka is still in every artist who works in spaces that damage their bodies because the work is worth it, because the images matter, because the wall must be covered with something true. The strikers of Deir el-Medina are still in every worker who ever said, I will not continue until this is fair. The scribes are still in everyone who writes things down because they believe that what is written will last. Egypt is not past, it is buried, which is different. And tonight, in your warm bed, with the lights low and the sounds of your own present moment around you, you are a few layers above all of it, above the bread and the beer and the flood and the tombs, connected to it by the uninterrupted chain of human births and human deaths that goes all the way back to the first person who pressed their hands into the mud of a riverbank and watched the water begin to rise. The flood is coming. It always comes. And it always brings with it something that makes the next season possible. Close your eyes. The desert is cooling. The stars are out over Deir el-Medina. The cliff tops are dark. And somewhere in the field of reeds, which is an idealized version of the Nile Valley, familiar and beautiful and permanent, a woman is checking her grain storage and thinking about the harvest and letting the evening be too good for calculations. Sleep. Thank you as always for being here. If Dull Tales is part of your sleep routine, subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you about ancient Egypt tonight. I promise I read every single one. Next time, Rome. The noisy, chaotic, deeply human Rome that nobody puts in the movies. But tonight, Egypt. The gift of the river, the bread in the oven, the apricot light on the cliffs. Good night. There is one more thing I want to tell you about before we truly close. I want to tell you about Hatshepsut. Because we have been spending our time in the New Kingdom, in the era of Ramesses II and his 67 years of magnificent self-promotion, and it would be a disservice to ancient Egypt not to mention the woman who was, by many measures, the most remarkable ruler in its 3,000-year history. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt approximately 200 years before Ramesses, during the 18th dynasty, the same dynasty that would later produce Tutankhamun, who you know, and Akhenaten, who tried to replace all the Egyptian gods with one sun disk and had a much worse reign than the history books of the 1970s suggested. But before both of them, Hatshepsut. She came to power as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III after the death of her husband, the pharaoh Thutmose II. This was not an unusual arrangement. Egypt had provisions for female regents, and several women had served in that capacity during their sons' or stepsons' early years. What was unusual was what Hatshepsut did next. She declared herself pharaoh. Not regent, not queen, pharaoh. She adopted the full royal titulary, wore the double crown and the false beard of kingship in her official images, and ruled Egypt as its primary monarch for approximately 20 years, during which time the country was prosperous, at peace, and extremely busy with building projects. The mortuary temple she built at Deir el-Bahari, across the river from Thebes, is still considered one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world. Set into the natural amphitheater of the limestone cliffs, built in terraces with elegant colonnades, it is a piece of architecture that communicates something important, that its creator was not trying to overpower the landscape, but to converse with it. She also sent a trading expedition to the land of Punt, probably somewhere in the Horn of Africa, the exact location still debated, and brought back myrrh trees, live animals, ebony and aromatic resins. The walls of her temple record this expedition in detail. Ships arriving at a foreign shore. Egyptians trading with the inhabitants of Punt, depicted in the carved reliefs with the specific physical characteristics and the characteristic round dwellings of a real people. Trees being carefully carried onto boats, with their root balls intact to be transplanted in the gardens of her temple. This expedition to Punt is one of the earliest documented long-distance trading missions in history, and Hatshepsut ordered it because she wanted myrrh trees for her temple gardens. The most powerful woman in the ancient world wanted nice landscaping. I find this deeply charming. Now, what happened after Hatshepsut? Thutmose III eventually became sole ruler after her death and had a spectacularly successful military reign of his own. And then, approximately 20 years after Hatshepsut's death, someone began systematically destroying her images. Her statues were smashed. Her name was chiseled off inscriptions. Her images in the temple carvings were defaced or replaced with generic figures. The attempt was thorough enough that, for many centuries, historians did not know she had existed. It was only through careful archaeology in the 20th century, literally piecing together smashed fragments of statuary from a quarry pit where they had been dumped, that her reign was reconstructed. Who ordered the destruction of her memory? Most historians' best guess is Thutmose III himself, or possibly his son, trying to smooth the dynastic succession by removing the awkward evidence that a woman had been pharaoh in the middle of it. Not because she had been a bad ruler, by all evidence she had been an excellent one, but because her existence complicated the male line of succession. She was given the second death. Her name was erased. Except not quite, because the Egyptians who were covering her images did not always do a thorough job. Some of her cartouches were simply overpainted rather than chiseled. Some of her statues were buried rather than destroyed. And the temple at Deir el-Bahari, being made of limestone rather than the softer sandstone used at other sites, resisted defacement. Much survived. She did not receive the full second death. Her name survived in enough places to be recovered. And now she is among the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history, her story told in every major museum that holds Egyptian collections. Her temple, one of the most visited sites in the Luxor region. History tried to erase her. History failed. This is one of my favorite facts about ancient Egypt and about history generally. The people who tried to erase her understood something real, that names and images persist, that memory is powerful, that a pharaoh without a record might as well not have existed. They were trying to use the Egyptian belief in the power of names against her. But they underestimated how thoroughly she had built her legacy. You cannot smash everything. There is always a fragment left in a quarry pit waiting to be found. Let me tell you about one more person before we sleep. A boy named Nefret. He is 12 years old. He lives in Thebes, in one of the residential neighborhoods along the East Bank, in a house shared with his parents and his grandmother and two younger siblings. His father is a carpenter who makes furniture and coffin components for a workshop that supplies several of the local temples. His mother helps manage the workshop's accounts. Nefret has been learning carpentry since he was 8. He can plane a board to an acceptably smooth surface. He can cut a dovetail joint that, while not yet as clean as his father's, is clearly on the right trajectory. He has a particular talent for the grain reading, the ability to look at a piece of wood and understand how it will behave under a tool, which direction it wants to be cut, where it will be strong and where it will tend to split. This talent was not taught. It arrived with him, or developed so early that nobody can distinguish it from something innate. His father noticed it when Nefret was 9 and has been quietly directing the boy's education accordingly ever since. But today, Nefret has been sent on an errand. He is carrying a message to a scribe at the temple of Amun, a small papyrus roll, sealed with clay and impressed with his father's mark, containing something administrative about a furniture order for one of the temple's subsidiary buildings. The errand requires him to cross the river on the ferry and navigate the western bank on foot to the administrative offices attached to the temple complex. He has done this before, but not often. The ferry crossing, the crowds at the landing stage, the temple precincts with their priests and their incense and their sense of contained power. These things are large and slightly overwhelming to a 12-year-old who spends most of his days in a workshop that smells of cedar shavings. He delivers the message to a preoccupied scribe who takes it without looking up from his own work, and says something that probably means wait for the reply, but in the particular shorthand of official communication that Nefret has not yet learned. He waits. The temple administrative office is a cool room with high, narrow windows. The scribe writes. Other officials pass through. Someone brings a tray of food, bread, and some dried figs, and the scribe eats without stopping writing, which Nefret finds impressive and a little unsettling. The way all competent people doing their work unself-consciously are impressive and a little unsettling to people who haven't yet found their own version of that absorption. He looks around. On one wall, a shelf of papyrus rolls in their leather cases. The titles visible on the cases: administrative things, grain records, personnel lists. Not the fascinating things. But next to them, tucked slightly apart, a case he can see has a story title. He can read the characters for it, roughly, because his mother taught him basic reading as part of the household management, something about a sailor and a sea. The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, one of the oldest surviving Egyptian literary texts. A story within a story within a story, about a sailor who survives a wreck on a magical island and meets a giant serpent who turns out to be a kind of god, and who tells him something wise about the nature of grief and loss, and the specific futility of being miserable when you have survived and others have not. Nefret cannot read the full text, but he knows the title. His grandmother told him the story once, sitting in the courtyard in the evening, and he remembers the serpent's advice to the shipwrecked sailor, though he does not know the words exactly. Be brave, you will reach your home, you will embrace your children and your wife, you will see your house. This is better than all things. Who will bring food to the island I am on? For I am alone, I am with the sea. He is 12 and he doesn't fully understand it yet, but something in it touched something real, the way things touch something real before you have the words for what was touched. The scribe finishes the reply. He gives Nefret the sealed papyrus. Nefret crosses back over the river on the ferry, watching the water move, watching the western cliffs catch the late afternoon light. He is carrying a message from a temple scribe to his father's workshop. He is 12 years old. In 6 years he will be a journeyman carpenter, in 12 a master. He will make furniture that will be buried in tombs. Some of that furniture will survive. He does not know any of this. He just watches the river. The Nile is wide and brown, and moving steadily north toward the sea it has been moving toward for as long as there have been rivers. The current is picking up slightly. The flood is not 3 weeks away now, maybe 2. He can feel it in the water, the way fishermen and ferrymen and children who have grown up beside this river can feel things that instruments would need years to quantify. The flood is coming. He is not worried. He is 12 and he has his father's message delivered, and now he has the ferry and the river and the last of the afternoon light, and the western cliffs are the color of honey, and the world is large and old and somehow still young, and the serpent was right about something important, and he does not yet know quite what. He will figure it out. He has time. That is ancient Egypt. Not the treasure, not the curses, not the dramatic archaeology of sealed doors and golden masks, though all of that is real and all of it is extraordinary. But underneath it, always this: the morning bread and the eye paint and the flood coming and the children learning and the workers striking and the love poems on pottery and the man watching the light from his doorway and the boy on the ferry, not worried, with time to figure it out. This civilization lasted 3,000 years because the people in it were fully human and therefore fully capable of persistence, adaptation, ingenuity, grief, beauty, and the specific ordinary courage of waking up before dawn to make bread for the people who need it. You have those qualities too. Whatever you are carrying into sleep tonight, you have what they had. The flood always comes. It always recedes. The silt it leaves behind is extraordinary. Sleep well. The western cliffs are dark. Good night. Let me give you one more thing before sleep takes you. Let me give you the smell. Because everything we have been discussing, the bread, the market, the temples, the river, the tombs, has been primarily visual and narrative, and ancient Egypt deserves its full sensory dimension. The smell of ancient Egypt would have been, to a modern nose, intense. The river itself had a smell, not unpleasant but distinctive, the specific organic richness of the largest river in Africa carrying silt from the center of the continent. During the flood, this smell was stronger, the water cloudy and dark and fertile smelling, a smell that Egyptians associated not with decay but with life, because life followed the flood with a reliability that made the smell sacred. The city smelled of livestock and cooking fires and the natural waste products of large populations living at a pre-plumbing stage of development, which is, let's be honest, a significant smell that the tomb paintings politely do not convey. The spices and incense used in the temples were, in part, practical responses to urban air quality. Frankincense and myrrh are pleasant. They are also very good at covering less pleasant things. The temples themselves had their own elaborate olfactory environment. Incense burned continuously in some sanctuaries. The food offerings, meat, bread, beer, wine, fruit, created a complex of cooking and storage smells around the ritual spaces. The specific oils used to anoint the divine statues were expensive imported perfumes, and their scent, mingling with the incense and the candle smoke, created something that was probably genuinely beautiful. The workshop where Nakht's father made furniture smelled of cedar and acacia, and whatever glue was currently drying, and the particular sweet-sharp smell of freshly cut wood that anyone who has ever been in a carpenter's shop can identify, because it is one of those smells that apparently transcends cultural context and is simply good. Nefret's house smelled of the bread and the cooking fire and the linen she worked with, and the specific dry stone quality of the desert valley, a quality that anyone who has been to the actual Luxor region reports as distinctive and familiar and strangely calming. Something about the combination of heat and limestone and low humidity that produces a smell with no good name but immediate recognition. The Nile at dawn, and this I am told by everyone who has experienced it, smells like nothing else on earth. The combination of water and reeds and birds and the specific quality of the air at the edge of a desert morning, when the heat has not yet arrived, and the cool of the night is still present, and the light is beginning to change, produces something that travelers from every century have described with the same slightly inadequate words: ancient, clean, alive. The ancient Egyptians smelled it every morning. It was simply the smell of home. And the tombs. The tombs smell of time. This is not a metaphor. The specific smell of an ancient tomb, the mineral quality of sealed rock, the organic traces of the offerings placed inside, the cedar of old coffins, the particular dry dust stillness of a space that has been sealed for centuries, is something that archaeologists and Egyptologists describe consistently. It is not the smell of death, exactly, or not only that. It is the smell of preservation, the smell of a space that has been held outside of time. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he described smelling something. Not much, not strong, but something. The faint residue of oils and resins and porphyry. NGS, still present after 32 centuries in a sealed space. The smell of ancient Egypt, faint and specific and 3,000 years old, in a breath taken in a rock-cut chamber in the Valley of the Kings. That moment, that breath, is one of the most extraordinary things any human being has ever experienced. And the reason it was possible is because Egypt built to last. Not just the stone buildings and the painted walls. The whole project, the mummification technology, the tomb construction, the precise placement of offering vessels, the sealed doors, the dried climate, was a project of preservation. They were trying to defeat time. They were trying to make the present permanent. And in many ways, they succeeded. When you look at the face of Ramesses II's mummy in the Cairo Museum, which you can do, he is on public display, the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history available for inspection. You are looking at a man who lived 3,000 years ago, whose face has been preserved by the technology his civilization developed, whose individual features are as specific and as readable as those of someone you might pass on the street. That is Egypt's gift to us, not the treasure, not the mythology, the specific human face of a specific human person kept for us across 3,000 years. And if Ramesses looks slightly irritated about being looked at by tourists, well, nobody mentioned that this was part of the deal when they embalmed him. He probably thought he'd have more privacy in the afterlife. Now, really now, the day is done, and the evening has settled over Deir el-Medina and over Thebes, and over the Nile, and over the entire narrow green band of civilization running through the desert. Nefret has checked the grain storage. She has talked to Ka about the harvest. She has decided, quietly, that Ipit is old enough to be thinking about her future in a more formal way, and she will raise this with Ka in the morning, when there is time to discuss it properly, not at the end of a long day. She has let the evening be good. Ka's eye is improving. The children are inside. The stars are out. The flood will come in approximately 2 weeks, give or take, and when it does, the fields will go underwater, and the village will go to its higher routines, and the work in the valley will slow temporarily, and there will be time for the things there is never quite enough time for during the busy agricultural season. She is tired. It is the good kind of tired. She goes inside. The lamp is lit. The house is warm. And in the morning the bread. Always in the morning the bread. And the flood coming, and the silt it brings, and the fields reborn, and the civilization continuing, grain by grain and word by word and child by child and dawn by dawn, for 3,000 years. Sleep. The night is old. You are in good company. The Nile is still running. Good night.